Welcome to Focus 54, your real weekly guide to African news. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi, and today it's all about the climate, and you can feel the heat. You've seen the pictures, the maps coming through with the different weather forecasts that are making it very uncomfortable for you as a Zimbabwean. If you're watching us across Africa, especially in Southern Africa, the temperatures have gone up, the El Nino effect has gone up, and we start asking the very difficult questions: how did we get here? How can we fix this? How can we mitigate this? And how can our futures be a lot better? Now, what's going on is that the African continent is part of COP28. And for Africa, we want to explore different initiatives and solutions, and to hold the West and the first world and industrialized countries accountable to their pledges, to make sure that they pledge, will they pay for their contribution to the issue, that to the situation that we find ourselves in. And I've got two experts that will be joining us in the second and third segment to break down the real issues on COP28, not the propaganda, not the fluffy stuff, the public relations, press releases that we get, but the real issues that are affecting you and I in Africa. But we cannot get to that part without looking at what's going on around the continent. We'll start off with the African Union, where the African Union officially launched the China-aided Printed Center at a handover ceremony on Tuesday at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Now, Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission and head of the Chinese mission to the AU signed the handover documents and cut the ribbon to launch an operation for the printing center. We turn to Uganda now in East Africa, a very contentious issue that gets a lot of different worldviews, cultural, social, and religious opinions. And as the country staunchly criticized the United States' recent expansion of the visa restrictions on its officials, interpreting it as an attempt by Washington to enforce an LGBT agenda in Africa. Now, these new sanctions unveiled earlier this week targeted Ugandan individuals who were not formally identified, and the U.S. implemented an initial round of visa restrictions on Ugandan officials in June in response to Uganda's anti-homosexual act, which attracted a lot of attention globally. And I believe that that's one of the first reactory measures that the United States has had on that country. Back home in Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe is to host the CCJA conference in the year 2024. Now, Zimbabwe's judiciary continues to charm the region with the Secretary General of the Conference of Constitutional Judiciaries of Africa, the CCJA, Mr. Malaba Musa, visiting the country to assess the hosting. Now, in 2022, Africa showed confidence in Zimbabwe's justice system by giving a nod to host the 7th conference of the constitutional jurisdictions of Africa in 2024. These are the main issues that are happening in Africa, but you can never ignore how the weather has been affected. And we touch down on all of these issues in the second and third segment of Focus 54. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to the second segment of Focus 54, and I am joined in studio by Professor Mafongoya and Dr. Sitole, who's also the Executive Director of Business Council Sustainable Development Zimbabwe. Gentlemen, welcome to Focus 54. It's an honor to have you in the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start off with the good doctor. What are the key takeaways from COP28 so far?
Thank you very much for that question. I think what we can see is that there are some clear indications of action. I'll just pick three. One, the issue of countries committing, about 118 countries committing to triple their renewable energy generation, which will definitely significantly contribute to mitigating climate change. We are also looking at the issue of climate finance. There is also a pledge even to increase the climate finance, and obviously the loss and damage that we think is also going to be operationalized at the end of the COP. So I would say those three to me are quite significant in the climate change agenda.
Professor, your take on this one?
I totally agree. The key issue here is climate financing. The COP is not over, so they are still negotiating. Maybe it's over end of this week. But what is coming through, as he said, is the big thing is climate financing. To reach agreement on that $100 billion pledge which was made in Copenhagen a long time ago, but which never materialized. There is also issues to do with carbon credits, and a lot of companies in the north who are continuing to emit want to do carbon credit with Africa. And so far we don't have clear frameworks as how will this work out. And I'm sure this is being discussed. And before COP28, there was an African summit in Kenya last year. I attended that. So presidents and African leaders were trying to put their position together. Some of the key issues, the renewable energy, the hydrogen energy, some of the issues, technology transfer, and funding. That's the key issues which we want to know. But I'm sure we'll go into the funding mechanisms because there are some issues to deal with that funding.
I love talking about money, and I love talking about funding because you always want to ask where the money is going to come from. Now, like you rightfully said, we've had these summits over and over. But what makes COP28 different from the previous ones? You did mention Copenhagen, where there was a pledge of 100 billion that never really materialized, or figures of that sort. What makes this one different?
You see, this one comes at a time when climate change is hitting the real thing. The number of extreme events, flooding, droughts, heat waves, almost every country has experienced this kind of thing. So as Stoller said, it's no longer fiction, it's real. So I think governments and policymakers are now convinced that we're talking about a real phenomena. And we've gone around the circle of these pledges and so on. So the money is there, like for what is talked about, loss and damage. You see UK, Germany, United States, Japan, United Arabs, they pledged for that 300-something million. So the money is there, but the issue is how to access the money.
That's why I want to ask Dr. Stoller about the sustainability factor. Clearly, those in your field who've understood sustainability at economic levels and different levels, surely there is a calculation and a trajectory, financial trajectory, that makes this feasible. But why didn't it happen?
I think the one thing that we should appreciate is the magnitude of the issue that we are dealing with. For example, it is projected that in Africa alone, food production from agriculture system may be reduced by up to 20%, which is quite significant. GDPs for most African countries are also projected to contract by about maybe even 2, 3, 4%. So which means the millions that Prof has talked about are certainly not enough and cannot sustain. And then secondly is also the models that are used to finance those actions. So if the financing models themselves are also not sustainable, we will have money trickling it and then it's used, then it's the end.
So where's the money coming from? If I was to bring it into a Zimbabwean context, we have some of our blue chip companies, major contributors to the fiscus of the nation. Where are they charged money through in the environmental management, agency, or is it coming off tax? I know we've got tax issues that are trending in Zimbabwe at the moment. At local level, at macro level, where does money come from from these countries?
Thank you very much. I think what we should also appreciate is that for climate finance to work, there is need to really internalize these externalities. In other words, the climate change problem is brought into the boardroom, and then it also reflects into company operations. So where is the money coming from? We are looking at possibilities of investments that then look and consider climate change when they are being structured. We have a recent example of the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. So they are trying to consider the climate impact, the carbon footprint of a product before it can enter the EU market. So which means all those companies that contribute to emissions and proportionally to their contribution should also contribute to the money that then addresses the climate change problem.
All right, and then Professor, you did talk about all of these countries pledging. I know I don't really want to get into the geopolitics of things, but most of these countries that pledged, they're the G7, G20. They're the countries with veto power at the United Nations. Who can hold them to account?
You see, there's funding mechanisms. Most of the money will flow into existing frameworks. There's the adaptation fund. There's the GEF, which is a financial wing of UNFF, which manage all this money. But the issue is accessing that money. The national governments don't have enough capacity to access that money. One of the things is that you must have some of the entities in the national government accredited to the GEF to access that money. And the problem of filling in the forms and so on is very complicated.
Are we accredited in some way? We have EMA, which is very...
No, EMA is, as far as I know, is credited. That's one. Okay. But we are in a carbon crediting conference for SADC and FAO last month in Joburg, and we're talking about how these frameworks work. And there's a plea that we need at least 3 agencies to be accredited. So you can't access that money if you don't have an accredited entity in your country. So the money is there, there's millions sitting there, but if you don't have accreditation, that's it. But then there's another thing. You also have capacity for national systems to be trained to access that money. It's a lengthy process, and a lot of people don't get bothered with that because they are not trained. It's not a simple thing like we want 1 million. You've got to go through a lot of processes and
diligence and processes.
Yeah. So he knows it from the climate.
Well, we'll discuss that a little bit later as we get into the third segment, and you can hear from Professor that the money is there. Some countries have actually pledged and actually made funds available in different organizations, but you have to have the credentials to be able to access these resources. This is Focus 54. Please stay tuned for the third and final segment. Welcome to the third and final segment of Focus 54. We are discussing COP28. It's still ongoing, and this is a continuous process, an ongoing process, and we'll be monitoring this. But I am joined by Dr. Stole and the good professor who's in studio. Now, gentlemen, there is an element that we need to address. The first ever global stocktake is underway for parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. However, it's evident that some of the Paris goals have not been met, and how then can nationally determined contributions become comprehensive, particularly in Africa? I like using Zimbabwe as an example. We've been there, and how then can we get to a better place?
Thank you very much for that question. So the issue about the nationally determined contributions, I think the starting point is that they are nationally determined. So in other words, the countries, Zimbabwe included, determined what is feasible, what is practical for them to address in the context of climate change. So what needs to be done for them now to be comprehensive and also to be impactful? The first port of call are the policy frameworks. You would find that we have the NDCs, yes, but there are a lot other policy frameworks that address different sectors of the economy. So there is need now for the nationally determined contributions to then be mainstreamed into other government and other processes, which means our development pathways then are greened and they are low carbon. So that's very key. Earlier on, we've also talked about funding. Everything that needs to be done requires funding. And without funding, they will just remain a pipeline dream. So there is need to then convert those nationally determined contribution projects, programs, into bankable projects that can attract funding, and then they can be implemented. So that's very key.
Now, Professor, let's also talk about, I love the issue of money. The UAE, arguably one of the biggest producers of oil globally, they've pledged big amounts, and I know they will honor that one day or the other. But in terms of adaptation and mitigation, it's something we talked about off air. What is that transition from fossil fuels, from these high carbon emitting sources of fuel to greener energy? Is that feasible? Is that possible? And can we trust the UAE to transform?
Sure. Because they sell oil, they think they will make money out of it. But the transition to less fossil fuels, which means that market might be affected. But they are also affected by climate change. When we were at the Africa Summit, the Arab United was pledging to do green energy, the hydrogen energy.
From oil to hydrogen?
No, from water.
From water?
You split water. It's called hydrogen energy. You split water, then you use the liquid or gas nitrogen to drive cars, buses, aeroplanes. And then because you are burning again, you burn hydrogen with oxygen. You create clean water again. So it's to the advantage of everybody. So I remember the argument at African Research Climate Summit that the United Arab Emirates were pledging a lot of money in technology. There's a lot of research that has been done to sell energy, this hydrogen energy. A lot of countries have done a lot, and there's quite a lot where we use water to split. Water is H2O. So split water, get your hydrogen, and use it as fuel. So that they are interested to fund and help African countries to do that kind of thing.
Now we've got the worldview of where we want to go as a globe. Like what Dr. Stolle said off air, that we live in one earth and we're sharing the same earth together. But then there's the issue of Africa, which really touches me, that we contribute between 3 to 4% of the global.
No, 3.
It's 3%.
Yeah.
Yes, 3% of the carbon footprint. Yeah. Most of Africa is not emitting or polluting the world as much. Is there anything wrong with us still continuing as a continent to use fossil fuels? People are talking about the 5th industrial revolutions. We've got some parts of Africa that still don't have electricity and some form of industrialization going on. Can we just still not go and use fossil fuels, our coal and fuel and things like that? Can we not do that, Doctor?
Thank you very much for that question. I normally want to discuss coal in the context maybe of the other two. And I call them the dirty three: the coal, the oil, and the natural gas. So we find that in terms of polluting, certainly coal is the worst. Because, for example, carbon dioxide alone, you are looking at around maybe 90 kgs per gigajoule of energy. For crude oil-related products, you come down to 70. For natural gas, you go down maybe to around 50, 56 kgs per gigajoule of energy. So certainly coal is a problem, is a challenge. And coming to the question, can we tomorrow wake up and dump coal? The answer is a definite no. we
As Africa?
develop based, yes, we develop based on our resource endowment. And certainly there is need to find a way of transiting from heavily relying on coal and also even introduce other clean coal technologies and move towards greener energy as we develop. It's possible to do that. So we are not saying we don't, and the example from the West has taught us that where they were faced with a crisis in Russia, Ukraine, what did they do? They go back to their coal-fired power stations. So we don't want to end up being energy poor and also negating socio-economic development just for the sake of maybe being nice. So we don't want to just be triagers, but we have to be pragmatic. So yes, we have to use coal, but have a plan to transist, but also consider even other alternatives that are cleaner.
So within the next 10 to 20 years, if we're being very pragmatic, gentlemen, and being honest with ourselves, places such as South Sudan, Mali, and the poorer parts of Africa will probably not transition into green fuels anytime soon?
See, it's an issue of climate justice, because the hypothesis here is that the West used these dirty energies, as Dr. Stoll is saying, to develop, to be where they are. And they polluted the environment, and as we are 1/8, one atmosphere, and so on. So we suffer the most burden of climate change, and we have the least capacity to adapt. So in terms of Africa's position, we have to keep on demanding that the polluter must pay. It's an environmental principle. So that's why we are demanding this money, so that we adapt and mitigate. In addition, we also need technology for this greener energy things, so that technology transfer, because some of the technologies held up in private sector, there's intellectual property right. So the guys who split water into hydrogen might be private companies.
With that patent?
Yeah. So how then do we participate as Africa? So that's why we said we are demanding, in terms of climate justice, technology and funding, so that we access the technology. We also access, you see, the Paris Agreement is about reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yeah. And that means you have to reduce a lot of emissions within the next 2030, whatever the target is. But that cannot come around, because look at South Africa now. They use a lot of coal. Look at China. China uses the coal the whole world uses. So they are the worst polluters, you see. But in South Africa now, they are doing a lot on wind energy, which is cleaner energy, because they don't have hydro. So it's also linked to the carbon credits. So there is a myth here, which we are saying, the West can continue to pollute and will be paid for not polluting. You see, that's what you mean when you say carbon credit. When they say, don't use coal, we pay you for not using coal. Use hydro, use solar. So the coal you save, those are the carbon credits we buy from you. But if you see that equation, it's not fair enough.
It's not.
Because a ton of carbon in Europe is bought for $9. A ton of carbon in Africa is bought for $2. It's the same ton of carbon.
Same Earth, same globe.
So what's the issue here?
Gentlemen,
So this is a climate justice issue. These are the things which must be raised at COP, not small issues. That even when you go to carbon credit, there are a lot of people who are trying to buy carbon, even in this country. But the frameworks are not straight. Some people come, get the money, put it in stock exchange, get a lot of interest, and then farmers are not paid, and then later on they get paid. So we don't have a framework of doing these kind of things.
Gentlemen, I'm actually very angry right now, as I'm thanking you, Dr. Stoll and Professor Mafongoya, for coming through, because at the end of the day, it really shows that Africa is in a very precarious position, a catch-22, And like he has said, like Professor said, the polluter must pay, and we always continue to advocate for the polluter to pay. This has been Focus 54. Give us your thoughts and comments. We always have access to our good doctor and our professor. We can always have another version and a follow-up of this to see if we can hold the first world accountable. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi. Catch me on the next episode of Focus 54.